So I wanted to talk today about building a Grunt plugin. And I work as an architect at the CBC. I've been in an architect position for a number of years now. What that means is that I don't code as much as I used to when I was a dev. And so ever so often I get kind of itchy fingers. I need to develop something to feel like I've sort of accomplished something, to see tangible results from my work. And so this talk actually came out of sort of an itchy fingers project that I had to build a Grunt plugin to solve a problem that my team was having. So this is the plugin that I built. It's called Grunt SaaS version. What it does is test whether or not you have a particular version of SaaS installed when you start to run your build. We had this issue where, because of a bunch of things, reasons, sort of part of our workflow, we had to do all our building locally and commit the resulted files, which meant that we got into weird problems where different developers had different versions of SaaS locally, and so when they committed their built CSS, sometimes it was just sort of weird formatting differences. Occasionally, it was functional stuff that kind of bit us. So I wanted to figure out a way that we could sort of standardize across this, make sure that this wasn't going to be a problem. So this is the plugin that I built. But I didn't want to just come in here and tell you how to build a Grunt plugin. There are people here that probably don't even use Grunt, and that's fine. What I wanted to use this sort of process and this project as was a bit of a jumping off point to talk about tools in general, to talk about getting to know your tools, right? Grunt, NPM, Node, these are all tools that I've used for a while now, but never really spent a lot of time trying to understand. I get them set up, and then I kind of put them in the corner and let them do their thing, but I sort of never look at them again. I maybe add a task to Grunt or something, but I never spent any time sort of trying to figure out how this stuff worked, how it all fits together. And so this project was really eye-opening for me, and I got a lot more out of it than just having a plugin sort of to show for my effort. And so that's what I wanted to talk about today, was to use this process of building a Grunt plugin as this kind of jumping off point to talk about getting to know your tools. But we are going to talk about creating a Grunt plugin. You will be able to leave today building one if you wanted to. This is the documentation from Grunt that explains how to build a plugin. 6 steps. It's actually pretty straightforward. I'm going to organize it a little bit. The first 4 steps are basically scaffolding your plugin. That's what all of those mean. And then number 5, which is sort of surprisingly small considering how big it is, author your plugin. I'm going to talk about that in terms of development and testing. And then finally, publishing your plugin to NPM. So scaffolding your plugin and scaffolding in general. Like I said, those first 4 steps when you go to build a plugin, these are all just about giving you a starting point so you don't have to be starting from scratch. And so what the process looks like is you install this tool called Grunt init, and then you download a template for your Grunt plugin, and then you run it. And what Grunt init is this sort of interactive tool that will build a bunch of files and folders for you based on your answers to a number of questions. And it looks like this. Yeah. So when you run Grunt init plugin, Grunt plugin, it's going to start asking you these questions. So what's the name of your project? What's the description of your project? So I ran through this for this conference, so I'm going to call it WebU. It's going to be about Web Unleashed. And you start to answer questions about where's your repository, who's the author, where's your URL. And if you've looked at package.jsons ever, you're going to recognize where some of this stuff goes. When you're done, it goes and writes a whole bunch of files for you. And anyone who's kind of keyed in with front-end development tools these days, this may be kind of familiar. You may have heard of a tool called Yeoman, which does almost the exact same thing, very, very similar. To the point where the Grunt team, I found this in a blog post from Bocoup, they had pulled Grunt init out of the core Grunt module, but then basically said, you know what, in a few weeks we're just going to replace it anyway because Yeoman's coming. This was in February of 2013, so I don't know what happened in the coming weeks. They still mention Grunt init in the documentation for this is how you scaffold a plugin. I'm not sure why, but my point here is if you use Yeoman, if you're comfortable with Yeoman, or even if you're going to get into scaffolding, I would suggest going to Yeoman as opposed to Grunt init. Grunt init works, but there is a Grunt plugin generator for Yeoman, and they're more or less interchangeable. So for this purpose, I use Grunt init, but if you're going through this yourself, feel free to use Yeoman if that's what you're comfortable with. So what you end up with is a structure that looks like this. So after I ran Grunt init, I pushed all my files to GitHub, and this is what I ended up with. So there we are. So the tasks folder is where your actual plugin is going to live. There's a JavaScript file in here that started for you to start with your plugin code. Your test folder is pre-populated with some basic unit tests for this kind of sample plugin that they give you. I'll talk more about what's inside there when we get to testing. There are some kind of boilerplate files, some git ignore, JS-RC. That license MIT, if you notice when I was answering the questions, it asked me what kind of license I wanted, so what file shows up there depends on what I say. There's obviously a Grunt file. My Grunt plugin is still a Grunt module, so I have a Grunt file to run Grunt tasks and things when I'm doing my development and my testing. There's a README-MD file, and I want to pause here for a second. If you use Grunt, you've probably seen README documentation that looks almost exactly like this, which is, to me, actually one of the biggest benefits of doing this scaffolded approach to a Grunt plugin is that we don't do documentation as well as we should, for the most part. Maybe there are people here that do, I don't. But what was really great about this was being handed this file that was more or less done for you. You just had to kind of fill in some blanks, update a few, customize a few things about it, and you ended up with an actual usable piece of documentation for not quite free, but for cheap. And it's one of the big benefits of the scaffolding process that I got out of it. And then there's a package.json, and you've probably seen a package.json looks a lot like this. And you should be able to notice that a lot of those answers that I gave in the initial script ended up being values in here. So the templates that you use with Grunt or with Yeoman, you can use them to do sort of token replacement and things like this, end up with files that are actually populated with values that work for you. So now we have this scaffolded plugin. We have these sample files, these folders that are all built out for us, and we can start to dig in and actually make this into what's going to be our plugin. This is the Grunt file from my plugin. I wanted to point to this one line, grunt load tasks. The reason for this, I have kind of a personal pet peeve around like a black magic code when something happens just because a file is named a certain way, or like a method has a certain prefix, or something just happens if you know the kind of secret password. And for a long time, Grunt seemed like that to me. I didn't understand how things were sort of fitting together. And so what grunt load tasks is it telling Grunt, hey, there's a folder here called tasks. You should go looking in there for tasks. And the load npm task is the same thing, except it's going to go looking in your node modules folder. So those things that you've npm installed, this is how Grunt figures out where all those things are and how to get at them. I know people don't like writing that load npm tasks line because it feels super repetitive, but now that I kind of understand why it's there, it's a little less annoying to me, I guess. And then this is the start of my plugin file. So in my tasks folder, I have the SAS version.js, and this is kind of where I get started. So I'm registering a multitask, and if you know Grunt at all, multitask is just a task that can take multiple targets. Most of them are like this. I'm going to call it SAS version, I'm going to give it a description, and then I launch into this function. And this function is going to be what my plugin is, what my plugin does when you start to use it. And the first thing I do is look to this.options and this.data. And those are two of the ways that the person using your plugin is able to communicate with you, to tell you things about how they want your plugin to run. So if you look at a sample Grunt file that's going to be using this plugin, they're going to specify an options object. And that options object can be specified at the task level, and it can be specified at the target level. What's in that object gets passed through to you, and when you make a call to this.options, you can pass in a default object. So you can see I'm setting these two options, ignore patch and ignore minor, to be false. But in this case, because someone's telling me, whoever's using the plugin is telling me that, no, ignore patch should be true, when I use my options object, I'm going to get that value of theirs and then my default value for ignore minor. And then within the target, the this.data object that becomes available to you in your plugin is just all the key value pairs that have been defined in your target. So in this case, I specified that I need a version parameter. When you specify a target, that's the version of SAS I'm going to be testing for. So when I get into my plugin, I have access to this.data.version to say, okay, that's the version that I'm being passed. I can test against that and then eventually use it to see whether or not they have the right version in use. This is the scaffolded plugin that comes in. I'm going to jump back to this for a second. After you finish your grunt init, this is what your the file in your task folder looks like, and the name of it's going to be based on what you called your project. I don't want to go into a lot of detail here, but I just want to point out that this is different than sort of what I did. And you can sort of see, so they start looking at this.options, which we've already talked about, and then it launches into iterating over this.files. And again, if you've ever configured a Grunt plugin, you know that you can pass in this files object that explains patterns about what files you want to use for your plugin to affect. It iterates over those files. It does a Grunt file read and then joins them together, and then finally does a Grunt file write. So the plugin that comes with this scaffolding that you get from Grunt init, it's basically a concat task, and it's just a way of showing you basically how to do kind of file I/O stuff. Problem for me here was I wasn't doing file I/O. My task had really nothing to do with taking input files, manipulating them, and then producing output files. This ended up really not being a very good example for me. Most of the Grunt tasks that you use are going to be based on file I/O. If you think about minification or uglification or even Sass, those kinds of things, that's what a lot of our tasks revolve around. In this case, though, my task was about running a test and then deciding whether or not the build should continue, right? If you don't have the right version of Sass, I'm going to stop the build. I'm going to tell you what happened, but I'm not going to let any of their tasks run. So I went looking for an example of a task that I could use to sort of help get me started, to give me some of the cues and things that I needed to know how to do this properly. And like I said, a lot of Grunt plugins really are based on file I/O, but the one I ended up finding was, it was kind of under my nose, but JS Hint, right? So JS Hint works very similar to what I was trying to build in that it goes through, it runs a couple tests, and decides whether or not your build should be allowed to continue. So my plugin ended up looking a little bit different. It was far more sort of procedural. So all I'm doing here is checking whether or not, let's see if this works. No, it's probably not going to. Oh well. I'm checking based on the version that they gave me. I'm sort of breaking it up into pieces so I can look at the major version, the minor version, the patch version. And then I'm taking the options that they gave me, so whether or not I can ignore any of those things when I'm trying to decide whether you're using the right version of Sass. And I'm building a regular expression around it. And then I do this thing, shell exec sass-v. And what that is there is a node module called shell.js that lets you run command line commands from within your JavaScript. And in this case, exec is a synchronous, so like a blocking way to run those commands. I wanted this to be synchronous because if your build is about to fail because you're using the wrong Sass version, there's really not a lot of point in letting other things sort of carry on and then stopping them immediately. So I specifically sought out one that was going to be synchronous, that was going to be blocking. And then I just got to go on to check whether or not the version that I get as output from that matches this regular expression that I produced. So the shell.js thing meant that I've introduced this dependency, right? Now that when I want my plugin to run properly, I actually have to include this other node module. I have to make sure that you have it when you start to run my plugin. So in my plugin JavaScript, I have to require it. But in order for me to tell you that you need it when you run my plugin, I had to update the package.json. Now, I think almost all the development that I had done on projects that use Grunt, that use package.jsons, had been really focused on dev dependencies. Every Grunt file that I saw had lots of dev dependencies, right? Dev dependencies are the ones that you care about when you clone a repository. When you're developing a module, when you're testing a module, the dev dependencies are the ones that matter to you. Those are, like in this case, your clean, your JS hint, your node unit for testing. When you're working on something like a plugin, and this is the first time I had done this, if my plugin needs shell.js for you to be able to run it, that's not a dev dependency anymore. That's, I guess, an actual dependency. So when you're using git clone to work with a module, your dev dependencies are what matter. When you're npm installing a module, it's the dependencies that actually matter at that point. So also when I got into this file, I noticed that there's this other line, this peer dependencies, which I'd never seen before. And that actually came from the scaffolded plugin that I was given. And so I had to sort of look it up and figure out what's going on. What it turns out this is more or less a way to indicate that this module has this kind of plugin host relationship with another module. So if you think about my Grunt plugin, it's never going to work without Grunt, right? Clearly you have to have Grunt or else my plugin is useless to you. But it's not a dependency like shell.js is. It's not like you would want Grunt installed as a submodule of my plugin. That's not the relationship, right? What you want is Grunt to be available as more or less a peer, as a host system that this module can work directly with. But they aren't sort of parental relationships. So that's how NPM indicates when you have dependencies like that, where it's, again, more of these peers or these siblings having a plugin and a host. They call them peer dependencies. And there are some changes actually that are coming or have come recently in NPM about what happens if you don't have those dependencies and should install them, et cetera, et cetera. But that's, especially if you're working with plugins, you're going to see peer dependencies, and that's what that means. So we've got ourselves a plugin, right? I built this plugin, I use the shell.js, I'm able to actually test what version of Sass you have, I can decide whether you're right or wrong, and then carry on. At least I think so. Now, one thing I want to point out here, this is a massive warning caveat, don't do what I just did, which is do all your development and then start thinking about testing. Makes it easier to structure a talk like that, but for development, it's really not a good approach. And I got burned by this, and I'll show you later. Thinking about testing as early as possible will get you better results. And you don't even have to be sort of as extreme as like test-driven development stuff, where it's all the tests first and then the development. Even if you, as you're writing code, are even just thinking about how am I possibly going to test this stuff, you end up writing better code. You end up writing smaller, cleaner, clearer functions because you know there's going to come a time when you have to get a test to be able to talk to that function and pass in inputs and read in outputs and stuff. So, like I said, I got burned. I'll show you why, but big takeaway here is that to at least think about testing when you're doing your development. And there's a bunch of different tests that we can do, right? We can test for code quality, and I assume most people here are familiar with JS Hint. So JS Hint is a way to look at your JavaScript and make sure basically that it's sane, that you aren't making sort of syntax errors, you aren't using problematic structures that are available in JavaScript. We had Douglas Crockford here speaking this morning, who obviously knows a lot about the good parts of JavaScript versus the not so good parts. But the one thing I want to point out about JS Hint, even if you're already using it, is to make sure that you are applying it to all your JavaScript files, right? So if you can see here, I am hinting my Grunt file, I'm hinting my plugin file, I'm hinting my test files. You are going to get just as burned with a syntax error in your Grunt file as you are in your task, in your plugin code, right? So make sure that all your JavaScript files, as sort of corollary as they may seem to the work that you're doing, make sure you're hinting all of those so that you aren't going to get screwed by something that's hard for you to sort of debug and figure out later. So once we are somewhat comfortable with the quality of our code, we want to actually test whether it does the thing that we think it does. This scaffolded plugin comes with Node Unit, and it comes with some example tests for you to run against that sample plugin. And remember that sample plugin is based on this file IO concat-like task. I wasn't really familiar with automated Node Unit or automated unit testing tools beforehand. There are plenty of other ones out there. Node Unit is just one of them. Node Unit is relatively simple. It's not nearly as robust as I think some of the other ones out there are. But it's useful in this context. And again, my plugin was pretty simple. So just to have something, to have anything that provided this functionality was useful to me. So this is the Grunt file for the scaffolded plugin. And here I'm probably going to have a bit of a problem. But so what happens in this Grunt file? Oh, man. All right. So what happens in this Grunt file is we run a clean task, and the clean task cleans out the temp folder. And what the temp folder is you can actually see there's a WebU task here. And remember when I defined this through my Grunt init, I called it WebU. That's why this task is called that. What the tests do in this case is they actually run your plugin. So it sets up a task that runs your own plugin. And you can see that the inputs here, the files that are specified, what's coming in are coming from these test fixtures folder. So again, what the plugin is going to do is take those two files from test fixtures, concat them together, and in this case, output to that temp folder. So in that test folder that you're given from Grunt init, there's a test fixtures folder and a test expected folder. Test fixtures has a few of these files. And so the way that this gets tested is there's also a task here for Node Unit, and it'll just point to where the Node Unit tests are. So when you run the test task, it's going to clean out your temp folder. It's going to run your plugin, or this sample plugin, which is going to produce these temp output files, and then it's going to run Node Unit. And this is what the tests for Node Unit look like in the scaffolded plugin. And they're pretty straightforward. So it's basically just a series of functions that are going to run sequentially and do different types of tests. Now, that first function called setup is actually a special function where it will run before every one of your tests. So if you need to set up a testing environment, you can use setup and do any work that you need to in there before a test actually runs. But then it's just a series of functions. So default options is a way to test whether or not the default options target works. Custom options is testing custom options. So you tell the test how many results you're going to expect. In both these cases, you're expecting one. And then we're going to read a file from that temp folder, right? Remember, that was our output. And we're going to compare it against something from test expected. So this, again, came scaffolded, and the test is simply, do these files line up? The file that my plugin produced, is it the file? Does it match up to the file that I expected? If so, carry on, the test is done. So I mentioned before, my plugin wasn't about file I/O. My plugin, I ended up sort of designing it in a very kind of monolithic way, that I had this one function in this one file that took all the grunt input, right? I use this.options, I use this.data to see what I'm supposed to be testing, and then I run that test, and then I see whether or not it works. And the outcome of that test, if it failed, then I stop the build. I do a grunt warn and say, here's the problem. If it passed, I make a log message to say, yeah, you're good, carry on. You can't test this. I couldn't figure out how to apply tests to this structure because it's entirely possible that a successful run of my plugin was going to kill the build, right? There is actually a positive case where I want the build to stop because the version of SAS that I'm testing that I think you are supposed to have, you don't have. So I couldn't run the test the same way the scaffolded one does because it expects your task to run and then goes into the node unit test and says, okay, well, let's see whether or not we got what we expected. Which meant, like I said before, because I wasn't thinking about testing, I ended up coding this thing in a way that was not testable. So I had to refactor, and I actually took this from JSHint as well. They take the core function and move it out into like a library file. And so I have the framework of my task that does all the grunt interaction and then passes off to this function that I built in this library file. And in there, it's very simply, it takes in a string with a SAS version, it takes in some options, and then returns this object that says, yes, we were successful, or no, we weren't, and here's the message about what happened. And now it's very easy to run automated testing against that because I can very simply pass in all sorts of different inputs and then be able to actually test what the output was, whether or not it was what I expected. So my tests look like this. I do use that setup function because if I want to test whether or not you have the correct version of SAS, I have to know what version of SAS you have. So I'm using something, I'm actually not using shell.js exec here, I'm using child process exec just because it's asynchronous. In this case, I didn't care about blocking the system, but I have to find out what version of SAS you have, so now I know if I'm going to start to try and run successful tests, what version I should be using. And then I just go into, in this case, I'm testing invalid, so passing in a version that's not a real version, that's not in the correct format, making sure that that comes out with success equals false and a message that says, no, you can't use a version of that form, it doesn't make sense. So these are what my functional tests ended up looking like. And I went through a whole bunch of these to sort of go through all the different permutations of what types of inputs can I produce and what type of results can I expect. Which brings us to integration testing. So I was pretty sure at this point that my plugin itself, the function that I had written, did the things that I wanted it to do. If I gave it the right inputs, I would get the right outputs. But this was not supposed to be run like that, right? This is a plugin. So I was expecting people to use npm install to include it in their project and then have it run like that. So I wanted to be able to test what that looked like without just relying on the fact that, well, it's fine. If I just clone the repository, I'm pretty sure that it works. The kind of catch-22 here is that when we normally deal with dependencies in npm, we put in the package.json, this is the package that I want, and this is the version that I want. And npm goes off to the global registry that it's got, says, yeah, I know how to find that. I'll bring it down, put it in node modules, and then you can use it. But I hadn't published my plugin yet. I didn't want to publish my plugin because I hadn't tested it. But I couldn't test it until I could include it as a dependency. But I couldn't include it as a dependency until I published it. So I was trying to figure out, well, how am I going to do this? How am I going to use a plugin without it actually being out there? And I started looking into package.json and how it's structured. So in the dependencies object, and this applies equally to dev dependencies and pure dependencies, we're pretty used to seeing stuff like this, right? Package name and then a version. You can specify this a bunch of different ways. npm will happily go out and get the thing that you need for you. There are a couple of things that you can do in here that I wasn't aware of. So you can actually point to a tarball if you want. I don't know why you would, but if you want to, you can point to a tarball that's out there and use that to resolve your dependency. More interesting, you can point to any Git repository, and npm will go and get the files at that repository and use them in your project. This was potentially useful for me. I had been committing my code and pushing it up to GitHub so I could use it from there. I could have pointed to my GitHub repository. The problem that I saw was going to be that every time I made a change, if I did my test and it failed, I had to change something in my plugin. I would have to make that change locally. I'd have to commit it. I'd have to push it to the remote and then go back to my test project and then reacquire the dependency for it to work to see whether or not my change actually fixed the thing I wanted to fix. It's not the end of the world, obviously, but I figured a few iterations out I was going to get pretty sick and tired of it. I found out that you can actually use local paths, which is kind of a neat thing. You can just tell it, no, what, there's some files over here, that's what I want you to use to resolve your dependency. And this, in a lot of cases, would be sufficient. I could just write a very quick test project, include this as a local file, and be done. The project that I wanted to test my plugin with, remember, I had an actual problem that I was trying to solve here. We had a project that we were working on that I wanted to integrate this plugin with, and I was like, we have this production code. I don't really want to go messing with the package.json and use local paths that I have to remember not to commit because they're going to blow this up for everybody else. So I kept digging, and I went a little deeper, and I found something called npm link, which to me is kind of magical, and I kind of love it. What npm link does is it lets you use a symbolic link to resolve dependencies. So if you have the files for your plugin, for your module, locally on your computer, you can tell npm link, look, don't bother going to the global registry that I know you have. You can just come right here. I know where this thing is. Just use this. So what it looks like in practice is this. Let's see if this works. Yeah. So I'm trying to run my Sass version task, and it gets upset at me because I don't have the right dependency. So I'm going to jump into my Grunt Sass version repo that I have locally and do npm link. And that sets up this linkage in my local npm repository. Now I jump back to my project and say npm link this module, so Grunt Sass version. And this sets up the link to say I can resolve that dependency by looking at this directory that's over here. And now when I run my task, there. Happily goes off and does it for me, right? In this case it failed because I didn't have the right version of Sass, but you can tell that the plugin's actually working now, right? I haven't downloaded anything, I haven't done anything like that, which is a pretty cool thing. There's some kind of strange knock-on effects of this. You could theoretically be working offline if you wanted to. If you just had local copies of things like JSHint or concat or anything, you could npm link to them locally. But in this case, it meant that I could test this plugin without having to worry about publishing. I'd come back to that later. I could have a package.json in this production module that pointed to where it was going to be when it was published. But in the short term, I could actually use npm link to get around the fact that it hadn't been published yet. And my changes actually happen in real time. If I go into my plugin folder and make a change and then rerun this task, it's going to see those new files immediately. There's no reacquiring the dependency. There's no getting the new files. It's already there because it's linked straight to that folder. When I was done with that, I was sure I was ready to go. This is it. I was done. Tested the functions. I've tested as a plugin how other people are going to see it. I was pretty sure that we were finished. So I was ready. I was ready to publish. I was ready to get my name in lights on NPM. And this looked like the easiest step, right? NPM publish, and you're done. And it was so close. It was so close. I was so excited that this was going to be this easy because everything else had been way harder than I expected. And it's almost this easy, but you actually have to go and register at npm.js. It's not like a big deal, but all the plugins that go up to npm, they're actually associated with a user account. So you have to go there and register first, and then use this npm add user command, which sets up that account on your local machine so it knows who you are. So then when you go and npm publish, at least it can put your face beside the plugin, which is really the point. I also want to point out there is also npm unpublish. When you go and make your plugins, I know they're going to be fine, but I like to know where my undo button is. So you can npm unpublish something that you've published to npm. You can unpublish certain versions. You can get rid of the entire module, just so you know. But that's it. I made a plugin. And I was pretty pleased about this. But like I said, what I ended up getting out of this wasn't just a plugin. It wasn't just to be able to see my face on npm. It wasn't just to solve this problem that my team had. What I ended up getting out of this was actually a lot of other little tips and tricks and things that I've sort of mentioned, but that ended up having all these positive effects on other projects that I went on to work on. So I want to kind of go over some of that stuff. Yes, you can now go out and build a Grunt plugin, but even if you aren't going to do that, there's some other things here that can be really useful to you. So scaffolding, there are really solid scaffolding tools available. And if you aren't already using them, you should go look into especially something like Yeoman. Yeoman has a lot of support from the community. There are a lot of generators out there for all kinds of different projects, not just Grunt plugins. You want to build Angular apps, React apps, jQuery-based web apps, whatever. They're all out there. GruntInit is fine. It doesn't have nearly as much support. It works for Grunt plugins, and there are a few other templates, I think, but Yeoman's a really good one to play around with. Using these scaffolding tools pretty clearly saves time, right? I didn't have to go and create all those dozens of files that got built for me. Just by answering a couple simple questions, I got all this stuff handed to me, which was really, really nice. But also avoids mistakes, right? So in the past, I would have maybe done this by if I had it, maybe going to an old project of mine and copying the files out of there and putting them in a new project folder, and then trying to search and replace for all the stuff that I know I had named based on the old project. And there's all kinds of opportunity there to miss things and forget things and include things you don't want, et cetera. So it's nice that going through this process, you know you're going to get it's exactly what you want, and it's going to be customized in the project that you're about to build. But it also makes dull work easier. Dull is maybe not the right word, but like I was talking about for documentation, right? Like, yeah, we know we're supposed to do documentation, but it's always like the last thing, and we just want to get it done because then we can say we're finished. Having that scaffolded README, and even to some degree having those scaffolded unit tests, right? Unit testing wasn't something that I had done a lot of, and it wasn't something that I had really built into my process. And having that test folder and those tasks that were in that grunt file to say, here's the tests that are going to run, was like a big sort of item on my to-do list, right? I knew those things were there, they hadn't been customized yet, so I had to go and fix them, as opposed to starting a new project and not having those things at all and being like, yeah, I'll remember to get to my unit test, I'll remember to get to my documentation. And finally, so you can find existing templates. Like I say, Yeoman has a lot of generators that you can use for all the different types of projects that you want to work on, but you can build your own, which is even better. So if you have, a type of boilerplate or a type of version or a type of project or the kinds of things that you do every time you start a new project, you can actually create your own Yeoman generator, your own Grunt init template to get those things done automatically for you, which is great. So testing. Yes, develop a testing in mind. This is another yes, I know, I'm supposed to do this. Like I said, going through this process, I got kind of burned by this, but it helped me internalize this idea. And again, I haven't gone all the way to test-driven development or anything, but I know now that thinking about testing when I'm writing my code is going to help me produce better code. And then you should be using an automated test tool. If you're going to write code that can be tested, then you should test it. And even if you aren't getting all 100% code coverage or anything like that, being able to run tests against your code is a huge benefit for when you go back 6 months later and have to do a version 0.1.1 of this plugin that I wrote, and I've forgotten how it kind of works, and hope that what change I made isn't going to go and break something that I forgot about. I learned about managing dependencies. So npm link, I still think it's so cool that you can use it to manage these local dependencies, that you can use it, that you can avoid going to the npm global repository to get these dependencies and resolve them. But it turned out that actually using Git repos to resolve a dependency ended up being really useful to us. We were able to build a project using an architecture that we never even would have sort of conceived of before we learned some of this stuff. So we wanted to build kind of a single-page app framework. And we wanted to have these shared core files and be able to spin up these really, really thin application instances that just dealt with the little stuff that was specific to each one, so the look and feel or where the content source was. But we really wanted to focus on these core files that really had the brains of the application. And so what we did was we built this core module, and in all the instances in the package.json, we actually put a dependency to our Git repository where the core files lived. Now, we don't publish our stuff on npm. We have it locally on a stash repository. But we were able to say, those core files, they can be found at this Git address. And when we wanted to develop on the core files, we would clone a demo version of our app. We would clone our core files and then use npm link to hook them up. And then we could develop a way on our core files and just build this demo app and be able to test all our stuff in real time. And it meant that we ended up with this architecture for this project that we wouldn't have even conceived of necessarily before we realized, there are tools that let us do this, that we can build a project that has dependencies like this and we can make them work in an environment where we have a whole bunch of developers working on this thing. And then I want to talk about contributing. So I was able to build a Grunt plugin. I was able to contribute it back to npm. There are a handful of people that are using it, which is great. I hope it's been able to save them time. I hope they've gotten value out of it. But this isn't just about Grunt plugins. The process for contributing to all kinds of other tools is more or less the same. The details differ a little bit, but in principle, building a Gulp plugin, building a Grunt init template, building a Yeoman generator, building a Hubot script. Does anyone here know what Hubot is? Nobody? Oh, you should find out. If anyone uses Slack, Hubot's like a scriptable bot. You can write your own scripts and get the bot to do things for you. It's super fun. But there are scripts that are available. Anyway, you can contribute back to it. But again, the process is very, very similar for doing all these things. So even if you don't even use Grunt or don't want to write your own plugin, there are lots of other tools that you probably do use that you can contribute to and follow sort of a similar process. And I sort of wanted to end on this because the arc of this process for me started with kind of scratching my own itch, right? We had this problem on our team. I was trying to figure out a way to solve it. And I ended up with a plugin that I was able to contribute back to the community. And like I say, some people have gotten value out of it, and that's great. But this was also this huge opportunity for me to really get to know these tools that I didn't understand. I hadn't spent the time understanding. And I could have learned Grunt intimately by reading all the documentation. I probably could have learned it by, browsing through all the source code and figuring it all out, but I'm a developer, so doing the thing is really how I learn. And so this project ended up being this great opportunity for me to do that. And that's really what this is about. This is about finding a way, wow, oops, there it is. To learn your tools. To find this project, to find a project like that, or invent a project like that you can use that gives you this excuse to really go deep on some of these things that you're already using and maybe don't fully understand. And maybe in a year from now, you're going to have learned a number of things that you would never have been able to predict. And maybe in a year from now, you can get up on this stage and you can tell us all about it. Thank you. How long do we have? Yeah, we have 5-6 minutes. So if anyone has any questions.
You mentioned what specific problems were you having with different versions of SAS?
So the question was, what problems were we having with different versions of SAS? So some of them were just kind of inconveniences. So different versions of SAS, for some reason, the output would sometimes be different, just syntactically. Functionally, it was all the same, but the CSS files that got produced by different versions of SAS were just different. So when you diff the files, when you look at what had changed commit to commit, it would say like, no, your CSS file is totally different, just because it had changed the order of properties and things like that. In a handful of cases, we got burned where the output was actually functionally different, that there were changes that had happened in certain versions that made it so that things got compiled a slightly different way, or that some of the specificity was different, and it actually produced different results for us. Didn't happen very often, but again, because we were committing our built files, we kind of ran into this because those were the things that were going out, and so the next developer would come along, build with an older version of SAS, and they'd be like, no, it's not a problem, everything looks fine to me. The original developer would come in, develop with their version, and build it, and then you would see this problem that no one could reproduce. Like I say, it didn't happen often. It was more of an inconvenience most of the time, but there did seem to be a surprising number of differences in build files, version to version on SAS. I don't know why. Anyone else? No? Great. Great to leave early? All right. Thanks very much.